Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's time once again for our Atin segment, and some of you faithful regular listeners will know what we're covering today, because this is a third of a three-part series on the component parts of saving faith. 2 weeks ago we looked at notitia being the word that describes the actual content, and that in order for us to have saving faith, we at least have to understand what that content is. Last week we looked at assensus, which means to assent to or agree to the notitia. I think that that's true. The notitia is Jesus died for sinners. Jesus is raised from the dead. Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. Resting in the finished work of Christ is how you have peace with God. You can agree to all of that, or you can understand all of that and disagree. You can agree with all of that and still not be saved, which brings us to part 3, Fiducia or Fiducia, Fiducia. You have heard English words grounded in this Latin root. That there are those who maybe have a fiduciary responsibility. That is, if you give money to an investment counselor and ask him to invest it, he has a fiduciary responsibility. So it's a financial commitment. It really comes down to, and this is one of the reasons why our banks are sometimes called trusts, it really means trust. And trust is a different thing than agree. Think of it this way. This is a typical common illustration of the point. I'm sitting in my office right now, and across from me, about 8 feet away, is a lovely oxblood leather armchair. It's really quite nice. My wife got it for me at the Goodwill store. And it's a chair, and it's sturdy. And if you were to ask me, RC, do you believe that chair will hold you? Well, first, do you know what chairs are for? Do you know what they are? Do you understand? Yes, I know what a chair is. Is that a chair? Yes, that is a chair. Do you think that chair will hold you? Yes, that chair will hold me. I'm still at a census. To get to trust, I have to sit down in it. With respect to the gospel, I have to say, that's for me. It's my only hope. Lord, forgive me, a sinner. Lord, I need the blood of Christ to atone for my sins. Now, if you remember from last week when we looked at a census and I talked about Gordon Clark and John Robbins and how there are those who would argue that a census is enough, and they take the view that to add to a census is to sneak works back into how we're justified. Well, I would be sympathetic to that view, except for the fact that fiducia, while it is something in one sense that's beyond a census, it is not something that we do. In fact, it is an acknowledgement of our not doing. That is, this is why I use the shorthand when I'm trying to describe how it is that we're saved. I say, we rest in the finished work of Christ. Sitting down is not going somewhere. It's not standing up. It's not holding myself up. It's resting. And so when we rest in the finished work of Christ alone, we're not doing. We're affirming that we're not doing. We are resting. We are trusting. We're saying, this is in your hands, O Lord. That's what it means to trust. It's important for us to remember this and not to make the mistake of thinking that our faith, however we define it, is the ground of our justification. As if my belief atones for my sins. No, it's Jesus that atones for my sins. The work of Christ becomes mine through faith. It appropriates the work of Christ when I rest in the work of Christ. But it's not my resting, and it's not my appropriating, and it's not my faith by which God declares me to be just. He doesn't look at me and say, oh, you have faith? Oh, people with faith are my favorite kind of people. Those people without faith, I send them away. But you've got it going on. You've got that faith train running, and I want you to come on up here and check into the Heaven Depot. No, you don't get to heaven on roller skates, and you don't get to heaven on your faith. You get to heaven through the work of Christ, which you appropriate, which you own, which you take, which you receive by faith and by faith alone. Which faith is a fides viva, a living faith, a trusting faith, a resting faith. I am grateful for everyone who is on guard against sneaking works into our salvation in any way. I am 100% down with those who would say Jesus plus anything equals nothing. It's just Jesus. That said, saying, yes, Jesus died for sinners is not at all the same thing as, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. We come now in our ongoing series on the Psalms to Psalm 4, which is sufficiently brief that I'll be able to read the whole of it to you. This is Psalm 4. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? Selah. But know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. Selah. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. You have put gladness in my heart more than in the season that their grain and wine increased. I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. I suspect if we were to sort of lay out all 150 Psalms and categorize them on their major themes, I would suspect that probably more Psalms embrace the main theme of this Psalm than any other main themes of other Psalms. This is another place where the psalmist, again, David, is in a situation of distress, crying out for God's deliverance, but at the same time calling on himself, on his spirit, to set aside the fear and the worry, and to rest and to trust in the living God. This is not simply help. This is help. But Lord, when I think about it, I think about all the ways you have helped me in the past. I think I have every reason to be confident that you will continue to be a help to me. So there's a lot of self-talk here, or a lot of preaching of the promises of God by David to David. Now, there is as well some level of rebuke to those who are causing the hardship and the grief. But isn't it interesting how much of the attention, there's not a long list of you did this terrible thing to me and that terrible thing to me, not a long list of God's going to do this to you and God's going to do that to you. So much more is, I need to remember this. I need to focus my attention here. I need to train my mind to remember these unchangeable truths even in the midst of hardship. I think that tells us something about how we're supposed to deal with hardship. We're so eager to ask God to change our circumstances, and so slow to ask God to help us change our perspective. When we're in the midst of hardship, it's a great time to recount to ourselves God's deliverances in the past, to remember God's faithfulness, to remind ourselves that, more important than whether or not I'm comfortable is whether or not I'm pursuing God and honoring God in the way that I should. It's better to be a good man being treated badly than to be a bad man living the good life. That's what matters most. Again, I'm not wanting to diminish the reality of anybody else's pain, including my own pain. Hardship is real. It's genuine. And again, one of the things that we're blessed within the Psalms is that reality, that acknowledgement. These are not Hallmark cards saying, don't worry, be happy. These are genuine cries of hardship, followed by genuine encouragement to remember and to meditate on the grace of God. I can't tell you how often I find myself in a situation dealing with others who are in times of hardship and saying to them, God is always faithful. God works all things together for good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. God is at work. Now, I am not rebuking you, I would say. I'm not rebuking you for that sense of hardship that you're experiencing. I'm trying to help you move away from it. I'm not saying shame on you for not knowing this. I'm simply reminding you of what we know. The exact same thing that I would do and do for myself when I'm in similar circumstances. So don't deny the reality of your pain, but do speak back to it the sure and certain promises of God's word. That is precisely what David is doing here, and what we're going to find him doing regularly as we continue to make our way through all of the Psalms. Trust in the Lord. Rest in him. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. Put your trust in the Lord. That's my prayer for me and my prayer for you. It's time once again for another one of our Curating Your Book Library segments. And once again, as I did a few weeks ago, I thought it would be fitting to speak for a few minutes about a particular book that we have chosen for the curriculum that we have created for the Shepherd's College. Our very first class on apologetics will have our students reading through this particular book that I want to commend to you. That said, I feel a little bit awkward commending it to you because I happen to be very close with the author. The author of this apologetics book, in fact, is a fellow that I see every time I see in the mirror every time I shave. That is, it's a book that I've written. The book is called Tearing Down Strongholds. And it is a book that is in the genre of apologetics in a couple of different ways. One is a worldviewy kind of way. That is, the first 2/3 of the book are devoted to the apologetic work of tearing down strongholds, of looking at ideologies that come out of anything other than the Christian faith, looking particularly at their epistemologies. Now, epistemology is a big word. It just simply means how we know what's true. And everybody has some kind of epistemology, maybe not as thoughtful some as others, but we all have a standard by which we judge something to be true or false. And what I do is take some of these standards that are part and parcel of other worldviews, and I test them against themselves. For instance, one of the chapters is on behaviorism. Behaviorism is this ideology that says that we do what we do, believe what we believe, because our environment has conditioned us to do so. A behaviorist is someone who is all in on the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. It's all nurture, and part of the appeal of the behaviorist perspective is this idea that if we are shaped by our environment, then, hey, why don't we reshape our environments to create people the way we would like them to be? So that's the behaviorist ideology. And what I do in this book is say, okay, if it's true that we believe what we believe because our environment conditioned us to believe it, then let's see if our environment conditions us to believe that we believe what we believe because our environment conditioned us to do so. In fact, the truth of the matter is, proponents of behaviorism, the idea that we believe what we believe because we're conditioned to believe it, seek to persuade us of the truthfulness of their perspective, not by reshaping our environment, but by trying to give rational, coherent, logical arguments in defense of it. And every time they give a logical, coherent, or attempt to give a logical, coherent, rational defense of their behaviorism, they're demonstrating that they themselves don't even believe it. So we do that kind of thing with relativism, with nihilism, with naturalism, with logical positivism, all these different isms like we cover on our ism segment. We go through all those in this book, Tearing Down Strongholds. But then in the second part, the last third of the book, just as G.K. Chesterton wrote orthodoxy after he wrote heresy. In heresy, he's tearing down the ideas of those who didn't share his ideas. And after doing such a marvelous job, his opponent said, all right, now do you. Let's see what you say. It's a lot easier to tear down an idea than it is to defend one. So why don't you do that? Well, that's exactly what I'm doing in this second half, trying to provide a biblical epistemology and a defense of the biblicalness of that epistemology. And in the midst of doing that, I'm also interacting with the dominant apologetic school of thought in the Reformed world, which is known as presuppositionalism. While it is the dominant form, and while I certainly have some overlap with it, I don't embrace presuppositional apologetics. I take the extreme minority view known as classical apologetics. And what I find, honestly, is that apologetics is somewhere in between, on a spectrum, somewhere in between epistemology and evangelism. And the closer we get to evangelism, the more comfortable I am with the presuppositional approach. The more close we get to epistemology, the less comfortable I am to that approach. So in this last third of the book, I'm trying to give a sound, biblical, faithful epistemology. So that's the book, Tearing Down Strongholds. It is one of my favorite books Honestly, I mean, obviously they're all my children. I love them all one way or another. But this is among my top few of my books, which is interesting because it is also almost certainly my least selling book. It did not do well. But you can change that even at this late date. It's been out for a couple of decades, and you can get it if you're interested. One simple way is to go to rcsproulJR.com and click on RC's books and scroll down, and there is a link to it. And if you get that book, it'll come through Amazon, but we'll get some credit for selling that to you. So that would be the most beneficial way if you have an interest in the book. If you've read the book, or if you read the book after hearing this, I would love to hear from you as always. In fact, if you read the book and you think it's full of hooey, I'd be happy to talk with you about it. I don't have an emotional grudge against my presuppositional friends. I think they are friends, and if I couldn't be friends with them, I'd be a pretty lonely fellow. So if you want to tangle over those things, I'm happy to do so. That's the name of the book is Tearing Down Strongholds. It's published, by the way, by PNR Press. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.